All right, everyone. Supposedly, Trump's approval is in free fall. If you listen to the corporate media, of course, they'll tell you that. I'm skeptical, actually, about the claim. Normally, when you have multiple polls saying one thing and one or two polls saying something else, you believe the core of polls that is larger. If you got 5-1, you believe the 5, typically. This is the one time I kind of am not sure that I can do that, and that's because it looks like we're seeing a round of weaponized polling to demoralize the Republican Party. I really mean that, and I'll say it like this. CNN and Marist and NBC and all these other firms come out with polls that they've been outliers consistently over the last few years. That is, that CNN has systemically underestimated Trump's support with regards to comparing it to the aggregate. They're showing him at like 37, 38 right now. The aggregate's around 41-ish. YouGov, which has ridden the aggregate almost constantly. That is, that it is almost right smack dab in the middle of the numbers. Therefore, we would assume there's a high likelihood over that course of time that their methodology is accurate at a greater level. Still showing him at 43, which is roughly where I would expect him to be. It was heading up towards 44. What's inarguable is that Trump's support has taken a small hit recently. But I don't believe it's a 3.5 point hit. What I'm seeing instead is that several polling firms, either coincidentally or on purpose, released polls around the same time, and they happen to be the firms that have systemically underestimated his support. It would be like if Gravis came in at the same time as Rasmussen and nobody else was doing polling for that week, you'd probably see a spike in his approval because they've systemically overestimated his approval. Rasmussen has him at 46, 47 roughly. YouGov is right in the middle, as always, between the upper level with Rasmussen and the lower end with some of these other firms, the Quinnipiacs, the Marists, and CNNs at the moment, and shows him roughly unchanged from the slightly lower level that he had come to. And the other reason is this. The other reason I don't believe this latest round of polling, even in the aggregate, is quite simple. When I look at the political climate right now, I can find no significant events lately that would account for a significant loss within the aggregate. That is, the idea that he would suddenly lose, according to them, if you discount, Rasmussen and YouGov, his support would be in the upper 30s right now, a decline of about 5 points. The Woodward book can't be responsible because the Woodward book was completely politicized from the get-go. It's not going to affect any of Trump's core fans. At this point, so many centrists, I think, have turned off they've basically shut their ears anytime they hear Trump did this, Trump did that, here's a tape, here's a book, because it's happened so many times. That strategy has been used by his enemy repeatedly, so it's falling on deaf ears. The op-ed doesn't make any difference. The op-ed is completely uncorroborated. Again, we've seen instances of this before. He never took a hit from them. So I can't imagine that some New York Times op-ed. How many Trump fans read the New York Times? Probably not a whole lot of them, unless they're reading it just for the purposes of being triggered or something. They're like masochistic or whatever. And Esteval came out the other day, and he's like, well, Trump he lies all the time. The economy's only working for the rich. And I'm like, actually, wages have begun to rise again. The economic markers have continued to incline. Wages have begun to rise. Some of the jobs being created now are actually stable jobs. They're not just flipping burgers. All of the economic indicators are better now than they were a few months ago. Trump's long-term approval for almost 3 months was completely stagnant around 43.5. What then can cause such a drop? Because they're claiming, these three particular polling firms are claiming he's in the mid to upper 30s at the moment, that his support has systemically collapsed by about 5 points, maybe 6 points. YouGov, however, which the two most recent polls are YouGov and Rasmussen, they're showing roughly the same numbers as before. And here's why I think that this is a blip that's the result of either inadvertent or purposeful release of these three outlier polls at the same time. If you just track those firms, if you just look at CNN where they've said he is, for months and months, every time they've conducted a poll, they've been considerably below the aggregate. It's a systemic thing. It's repeated. They're showing the same number now. That is, the number from CNN poll to CNN poll isn't any different. That's not a drop. That's the result of several low numbers being released at the same time, so they're included in the same temporary aggregate. Once they filter out, because these firms don't poll as often, it seems, lately, once those filter out, his approval will then be said to magically rise 5 points. But it won't be because it's rising. It'll be because it's where it was to begin with. You've just got a statistical blip because you compiled the wrong numbers, basically. It would be, again, it would be like if you had, let's say that YouGov overestimates by 2 points, puts him at 45. You also get a Gravis poll and a Rasmussen poll and maybe some other firm that just happens to show him high up. You get a Reuters poll or something. The polls that tend to be on or above the aggregate. His approval would look like it was 46, maybe 47%. But that wouldn't be the real number. It would be overestimating. It would be by chance or by purposeful design, because a bunch of polling firms that tend to show him at or above the real number happen to release their numbers at the same time. Therefore, they're knocking some of those lower results off the aggregate. They get outdated. It's a rolling average. You've got to understand that. This is that in reverse. You have 3 polling firms that are showing an abnormally low number, but those numbers are not actually changed from poll over poll from those firms themselves at times where his aggregate approval was around the same number, which has been for months and months now. It's been a long-term trend. Trump appears to have stalled out between 43 and 44%, just shy, by the way, of being out of the danger zone. If nothing else changes, the Republicans can look forward to a very good likelihood of losing the House. I mean that. The Republicans could very easily lose the House if Trump's approval is at that rate. Especially with the congressional ballot, I believe at the moment not particularly good for the Republicans. Unless they have a major success. They can browbeat Citizens United. Put super PACs and corporate donations back on the board, use it as an issue, make it your October surprise. It will probably counter the Democrats. At the very least, it'll show the difference between neoliberals and progressives. It'll take some wind out of their sails. It'll depress their turnout. That's what will happen, especially among youth voters. That could give the Republicans just enough of an edge to keep the House. You get your Supreme Court nominee. You set yourself up for 2020, but then here's the other part. If you do decide to throw that Hail Mary up, you need to deliver on that promise. Not simply say, well, we want to do something about corporate cash and corporate donations. No, you'll actually have to tackle it. The internet era gives us a much longer memory span when it comes to at least a handful of the top most important issues. As opposed to in the past, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. If you elect me, I will stop the war, lower taxes, and give you the moon on a stick. And then when you don't get any of these things, it's like, within a few weeks everyone forgets and they go back to partisan bickering. Not so in the internet era, as the Democrats are sorely learning at the moment. Trump, I think the one thing that probably is depressing his approval slightly is the fact that we don't have a wall yet. He hasn't said much about it lately. That was one of his major campaign promises. He at least needs to talk about it in a more visible fashion. I don't mean to your core fans at a rally. That's all well and good. Eventually, they're going to start tuning it out too. They say, 2 years on. We had some prototypes from the first batch of spending. That's literally all we got. We need a little bit more than that. We need you to at least lay some of the groundwork. At that point, Trump at least needs to talk about obstruction, because it is true. He's being obstructed by the Democrats in Congress, as well as some of the never-Trumpers. But after the midterms, it looks like the Trump Republicans will prevail. The never-Trumpers, like Ted Cruz, originally a never-Trump Republican, he's at hazard right now. He could lose to Beto O'Rourke. I don't think he will, but he could. Whereas Rick Scott, it looks like he's probably solidified a couple points lead. It's going to be a squeaker. It's going to be close. He could lose. It's not that much better than a 50-50 proposition for him, but it's better than... He's more fortunate at the moment than Ted Cruz is. We'll have to do some more Senate analysis pretty soon. Give maybe a more finalized set of predictions. It's halfway through September. We're getting up there towards election time. October is basically, you're waiting for that big scandal to drop or something. The Omarosa stuff obviously isn't it. The op-ed doesn't matter. The Woodward book doesn't matter. Nobody's even talking about it anymore. Meanwhile, you've got Ken Starr. Actually, people talking about that a little bit more. That's about all. Peace out.